Philippine Sea, October 13, 1944, 02:15 hours, and Lieutenant Commander Kenji Nakamura stood on the bridge of the cargo vessel Shinyo Maru, watching his lookouts scan the darkness with binoculars while the phosphorescent wake stretched behind his ship like a glowing trail pointing directly at their position, completely unaware that 15 miles away a Marine PBJ 1D Mitchell bomber was tracking his vessel on N/APS-3 radar screen, its operator already calling out bearing, and ranged to the pilot while 4 more Mitchells formed up behind, each carrying 8 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rockets under their wings. The night was moonless, the kind of absolute darkness that had always protected Japanese supply convoys from American aircraft, the kind of darkness that made visual bombing impossible, yet Technical Sergeant Robert Chen, hunched over his radar scope in the nose of the lead PBJ-1D, could see the Japanese vessel as clearly as if it were painted with light, the electronic pulse of the N/APS-3 penetrating the darkness with its 3-centimeter wavelength that no Japanese detection equipment could sense, no Japanese radar operator could intercept, no Japanese commander could even imagine existed in operational form. Nakamura had made this run between Formosa and the Philippines 17 times since the Americans landed at Leyte, always at night, always successfully, trusting in darkness and the vastness of the ocean to protect his ship from the American bombers that ruled the daylight hours. But tonight something felt different, something his experienced sailor's instinct couldn't quite identify, perhaps the way the radioman kept reporting static on frequencies that should have been clear, perhaps the way the lookouts kept turning their heads as if hearing something just beyond the range of perception. The Japanese Navy had assured him that American aircraft couldn't operate effectively at night, that their pilots lacked the training for night navigation over water, that their bombing accuracy dropped to less than 5% in darkness. Yet here in the waters between Formosa and Luzon, Technical Sergeant Chen was calling out corrections to his pilot, Major James Patterson of Marine Bombing Squadron 612, guiding the Mitchell bomber toward an perfect attack angle while the other 4 PBJ-1Ds maintained formation using only the faint blue exhaust flames of the lead aircraft as reference. The N/APS-3 radar system represented a technological leap that Japanese naval intelligence had completely failed to anticipate, operating in the X-band at frequencies that passed through the Japanese radar detection equipment like light through clear glass, using cavity magnetron technology that Japanese scientists wouldn't successfully develop until after the war, providing target resolution at ranges that made night attacks as accurate as daylight bombing. Marine Bombing Squadron 612 had spent 10 months perfecting the technique of radar-guided rocket attacks, learning to fly at 300 feet above the waves to maximize radar return from surface vessels, discovering that the 5-inch HVR rockets could be aimed using radar bearings as accurately as visual sighting, developing the coordination between radar operator and pilot that turned the PBJ-1D into a precision night attack weapon that Japanese naval doctrine had never considered possible. Lieutenant Commander Nakamura ordered a course change at 0230, following the standard convoy doctrine of zigzagging every 15 minutes to throw off submarine attacks, never suspecting that 15 miles away Technical Sergeant Chen was simply adjusting his radar bearing, calling out the new heading to Major Patterson, who banked the PBJ-1D to maintain the optimal attack angle while his wingmen followed in perfect formation. The Japanese Navy's night defense doctrine relied entirely on visual detection, on lookouts with night-adapted vision scanning for silhouettes against the stars, on searchlights that could illuminate attacking aircraft at close range, on the fundamental assumption that aircraft needed to see their targets to attack them, an assumption that had held true for every air force in the world until the Americans deployed their N/APS-3 equipped PBJ-1DS to the Pacific. The 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rocket had been specifically designed to solve the problem of attacking ships at night, its flat trajectory allowing accurate firing from longer ranges than conventional bombs required, its 134-pound weight with a 75-pound warhead capable of penetrating ship hulls and detonating inside, its velocity of 1,400 feet per second giving it the kinetic energy to punch through armor plate. Marine pilots had discovered that ripple firing 8 rockets in a spread pattern guaranteed hits even with the slight inaccuracies of radar-guided aiming, that the rockets' bright exhaust trails actually helped subsequent aircraft adjust their aim, that Japanese crews were so shocked by the sudden appearance of rockets out of complete darkness that their return fire was wild and ineffective. At 0245, Technical Sergeant Chen called out, "Target bearing 090, range 3 miles, recommend attack run," and Major Patterson pushed his throttles forward, bringing the twin Wright Cyclone engines to full power while descending to 200 feet above the water. the radar altimeter his only reference in the absolute darkness. Behind him, for more PBJ-1DS began their attack runs, spacing themselves 30 seconds apart to avoid the debris and flames from preceding attacks, each radar operator locked onto the target, each pilot trusting entirely in the electronic eyes that penetrated the darkness. Lieutenant Commander Nakamura heard nothing over the sound of his own ship's engines, saw nothing in the darkness beyond his vessel's running lights, suspected nothing until the first 5-inch rocket slammed into his bridge wing, followed immediately by 7 more rockets that walked their explosions down the length of his ship. The Japanese Naval General Staff in Tokyo had received scattered reports of ships being attacked at night by invisible aircraft, of rockets appearing out of darkness without warning, of vessels burning and sinking without ever seeing their attackers. But Admiral Somu Toyota and his staff dismissed these reports as hysteria from panicked merchant sailors, insisting that the Americans lacked both the technology and the training for effective night attacks. The reality was that Marine Squadron VMB 612, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Jack Cram, had transformed night warfare in the Pacific, stripping their PBJ-1DS of unnecessary weight including turrets and defensive guns, installing extra fuel tanks for 10-hour missions, practicing radar-guided attacks until their accuracy exceeded 50%, developing tactics that exploited every weakness in Japanese night defense doctrine. The Shinyo Maru took 8 rocket hits in the first pass, the HVR warheads penetrating the hull and detonating in the cargo holds, igniting the ammunition stored there, sending pillars of flame into the night sky that silhouetted the ship for the following PBJ-1DS. Lieutenant Commander Nakamura, wounded by shrapnel from the first rocket, ordered his gun crews to fire at the sound of aircraft engines. But the PBJ-1DS were already climbing away into the darkness, invisible against the black sky, their radar operators already searching for the 2 escort vessels that Chen had detected trying to flee northward. The Japanese Navy's doctrine for night combat assumed that attacking aircraft would need to use flares or searchlights to illuminate their targets, would need to descend to dangerously low altitudes for accuracy, would be visible against the stars or moon during their attack runs. But the PBJ-1DS violated every assumption, attacking from medium altitude, using no illumination except their victims' own burning ships, remaining invisible throughout their attacks. The second PBJ-1D, piloted by Captain Robert Hayes with radar operator staff Sergeant William Park, acquired one of the fleeing escort vessels at 0251, a Japanese destroyer that had accelerated to 28 knots and was zigzagging wildly in an attempt to evade attack. The N/APS-3 radar tracked every course change, Staff Sergeant Park calling out bearings and ranges with calm precision while Captain Hayes lined up his attack run, waiting until the range dropped to 2 miles before triggering his 8 VARs in a single ripple salvo. The destroyer's captain, Commander Yoshio Suzuki, saw the rocket exhaust trails appear out of nowhere, bright lines of fire descending toward his ship, but had no time to evade before the warhead struck, 3 rockets hitting the forward gun mount, 2 more penetrating the hull amidships, the remainder striking the water close aboard and sending shrapnel through the thin hull plating. Japanese radar technology in 1944 remained primitive by American standards, with their best sets operating at wavelengths that couldn't detect the American centimetric radar emissions, their operators trained to look for large formations at high altitude rather than single aircraft at low level, their coverage limited to a few major bases rather than deployed across the fleet. The Type 22 radar sets installed on some Japanese warships could detect aircraft at ranges up to 35 kilometers, but only if those aircraft were above 3,000 meters altitude, while the PBJ-1DS attacked at less than 100 meters, below the radar horizon, invisible to electronic detection just as they were invisible to visual observation. Marine Bombing Squadron 612 had arrived at Saipan in October 1944 after months of training in the techniques of night radar attack, their crews hand-picked for experience and temperament, their aircraft modified with the latest N/APS-3 sets that could distinguish between different types of vessels by their radar return, their tactics refined through hundreds of practice runs against American ships playing the role of enemy targets. Lieutenant Colonel Cram had insisted on extreme range capability, knowing that Japanese bases at Iwo Jima and Chichijima lay 630 and 750 miles respectively from Saipan, requiring his PBJ-1DS to carry maximum fuel loads and operate at maximum efficiency, which meant removing all defensive armament, all armor plating, anything that added weight without contributing to range or striking power. The third PBJ-1D to attack was flown by Lieutenant David Miller with radar operator Sergeant James Thompson, who detected a cluster of Japanese barges trying to escape along the coastline, their shallow draft allowing them to hug the shore where larger vessels couldn't follow. The Daihatsu-class landing craft had become the backbone of Japanese supply efforts in the Pacific, their crews operating only at night, hiding under camouflage during daylight, moving supplies and reinforcements to bypass garrisons throughout the islands. But they had never encountered radar-guided rocket attacks. Sergeant Thompson tracked 6 barges moving in column formation at 8 knots, calling out their position while Lieutenant Miller descended to 150 feet, low enough that his prop wash raised spray from the wave tops, releasing his rockets at 1-mile range in paired salvos that bracketed the formation. The Japanese barge crews had no warning before the rocket struck, the first indication of attack being the explosions that shattered their wooden hulls, the HVR warheads designed for use against tanks proving equally effective against the light construction of the Daihatsu barges. Lieutenant Takashi Yamada, commanding the lead barge, survived the initial attack only because his vessel happened to be between rocket salvos, but he watched in horror as 5 of his barges exploded and burned in less than 10 seconds. Their crews thrown into the water, their vital supplies of rice and ammunition scattered across the waves or sinking into the depths. The Japanese Navy had assured these barge crews that operating at night provided complete protection from American air attack, that the Americans couldn't navigate accurately enough to find small targets in darkness, that even if found, bombing accuracy would be so poor as to make attacks ineffective. Yet here were his barges burning like torches while he still couldn't see or hear the aircraft that had destroyed them. The 4th and 5th PBJ-1DS, flown by Captain Thomas Anderson and Lieutenant William Brown, concentrated on the surviving destroyer which had begun firing its anti-aircraft guns in random patterns, hoping to hit the invisible attackers by chance, the gun crews following pre-war doctrine that assumed attacking aircraft would be visible in searchlight beams or against the sky. The N/APS-3 radar operators guided their pilots through the flak patterns, calling out corrections as the destroyer maneuvered, coordinating their attacks to strike from different angles simultaneously, overwhelming the Japanese gun directors who were trying to track targets they couldn't see, couldn't hear over their own gunfire, couldn't even confirm existed except for the rockets that kept striking their ship. Commander Yoshio Suzuki had fought American aircraft many times during daylight, had seen his gunners shoot down dive bombers and torpedo planes, had maneuvered his destroyer through countless air attacks. But this night attack was unlike anything in his experience or training. Rockets appearing from nowhere, no aircraft visible despite clear skies, no engine noise until after the rocket struck, no opportunity to maneuver because the attackers seemed to anticipate every course change. The Japanese Naval Academy had taught him that night favored the defender, that attacking aircraft were at a severe disadvantage in darkness, that a well-handled ship could evade night bombing with relative ease. But these American Marine bombers seemed to see in absolute darkness, to track his every movement, to place their rockets with daylight accuracy despite the moonless night. The N/APS-3 radar system represented years of American and British research into cavity magnetron technology, producing electromagnetic waves at frequencies that seemed impossible to Japanese scientists who were still struggling with primitive long wave sets, generating enough power to detect targets at useful ranges while remaining compact enough to fit in an aircraft nose, providing resolution accurate enough to distinguish between ship types and even estimate their size. Technical Sergeant Chen, watching his radar scope as the Shinyo Maru listed further to starboard, called out to Major Patterson that the target was dead in the water, probably sinking, recommending they search for additional targets rather than expending more rockets on a doomed ship. Marine Squadron VMB 612's operational doctrine emphasized fuel conservation and ammunition management, knowing that their 10-hour missions left no margin for waste, that every rocket had to count, that returning to base with minimum fuel was standard procedure. The stripped PBJ-1DS could carry 1,520 gallons of aviation gasoline in their regular tanks plus auxiliary tanks in the bomb bay, giving them a combat radius of over 700 miles, but only if they maintained optimal cruise settings and avoided unnecessary maneuvering, which meant their attacks had to be precise, calculated, executed with mechanical efficiency rather than aggressive maneuvering. At 0300 hours, 15 minutes after the first rocket struck the Shinyo Maru, Lieutenant Commander Nakamura ordered abandon ship, his vessel listing 40 degrees and taking water faster than the pumps could handle, fire spreading despite damage control efforts, the radar-guided rocket attack having inflicted damage beyond anything the ship could survive. He would later report to the Naval General Staff that his ship had been attacked by at least 10 aircraft dropping hundreds of bombs with incredible accuracy, unable to believe that only 5 aircraft firing 8 rockets each had caused such devastation, unable to accept that American Marines possessed technology that made darkness irrelevant. The Japanese Naval Intelligence Service had been monitoring American radio communications throughout 1944, intercepting messages about new radar equipment, new night attack squadrons, new tactics for anti-shipping operations, but the intelligence officers in Tokyo dismissed most of these intercepts as American disinformation, refusing to believe that the Americans had achieved such a technological advantage, insisting that radar-guided rocket attacks at night were technically impossible with existing technology. Captain Minoru Genda, the brilliant tactical planner who had designed the Pearl Harbor attack, reviewed the reports of night shipping losses and concluded that the Americans must be using submarines with deck rockets, that aircraft attacks at night remained impractical, that the merchant captains were fabricating stories to excuse their losses. The 5 PBJ-1DS of Marine Squadron VMB 612 completed their attack at 0312, having expended 32 of their 40 rockets, sinking 1 large cargo ship, heavily damaging 1 destroyer and destroying 5 barges, all without taking a single hit from return fire, all without being visually identified by Japanese observers, all while maintaining radio silence except for brief coded transmissions. Major Patterson led his flight northwest toward their secondary search area, where intelligence suggested another Japanese convoy might be attempting to resupply the garrison at Iwo Jima. The N/APS-3 operators scanning the darkness for the electronic signatures of ships that thought themselves safe in the night. The revolution in night warfare that VMB 612 represented went beyond just technology, encompassing new tactics, new training methods, new maintenance procedures to keep the temperamental radar sets operational in the humid Pacific environment, new coordination between radar operators and pilots who had to trust each other completely when flying at minimum altitude in absolute darkness. The squadron's ground crews had learned to calibrate the N/APS-3 sets for maximum sensitivity, to adjust the antenna angles for optimal sea search, to troubleshoot problems that the technical manuals hadn't anticipated, becoming electronic warfare specialists without formal training, learning by trial and error what settings worked best for different conditions. Japanese destroyer Commander Yoshio Suzuki managed to save his ship through superb damage control and fortunate flooding patterns that corrected the list caused by the rocket hits. But he would spend 3 months in dock for repairs, his after-action report describing an attack by Phantom aircraft that couldn't be seen or heard until after their weapons struck, recommending that all ships increase their night lookouts and maintain maximum speed and continuous maneuvering during darkness hours. The Naval General Staff filed his report with dozens of similar accounts, all describing impossible attacks, all contradicting established doctrine about night combat, all suggesting that the Americans possessed capabilities that Japanese technology couldn't match or counter. Lieutenant Colonel Jack Cram had positioned VMB 612 as the solution to a specific problem, the need to interdict Japanese shipping at extreme range, at night, in weather conditions that grounded conventional bombers, using tactics that maximized aircraft survivability while maintaining strike effectiveness. His Marines had embraced the challenge, learning to navigate by radar and LORAN, to attack by instruments alone, to trust technology over instinct, to suppress the natural desire to see their targets before attacking, transforming themselves from traditional bomber crews into electronic warfare specialists who happened to fly aircraft. The 5-inch HVR had proved perfect for the mission, its flat trajectory compensating for the slight inaccuracies inherent in radar aiming, its warhead powerful enough to damage or sink the light vessels that comprised most Japanese convoy traffic, its rocket motor providing enough velocity to penetrate hull plating without requiring a diving attack that would be dangerous at night and low altitude. The rockets could be fired singly, in pairs, or in full salvos depending on the target, giving pilots flexibility in engaging everything from massive cargo ships to individual barges, while the bright exhaust trail provided visual confirmation of hits even when the target itself remained invisible. At 0345, Staff Sergeant William Park detected new radar contacts 20 miles north of their position, 2 large returns and several smaller ones suggesting another convoy, probably military transports based on their speed and formation. Captain Hayes adjusted course to intercept while Park refined his radar picture, determining that the large returns were probably destroyer escorts or corvettes, the smaller ones likely patrol boats or armed trawlers, all maintaining a tight formation that suggested they expected attack. The Japanese had learned to concentrate their anti-aircraft fire, to put up barriers of flak that attacking aircraft had to fly through, but this tactic assumed the attackers would be visible, would need to approach from predictable angles, would be deterred by heavy fire. The PBJ-1D Mitchell bomber had never been designed for the role VMB 612 employed it in, originally conceived as a medium-altitude level bomber for the Army Air Forces, adapted by the Marines for low-level attack, modified with radar for night operations, stripped of defensive armament for maximum range, transformed through operational necessity into something its designers never imagined. The aircraft's twin right are 2,600 engines, each producing 1,700 horsepower, gave it enough speed to escape after attacking, enough power to carry heavy rocket loads, enough reliability to operate for 10 hours over water with no possibility of emergency landing, making it ideal for the long-range interdiction mission despite its original design purpose. Technical Sergeant Chen detected submarine contact at 0351, a Japanese I-class boat running on the surface, probably providing distant escort for the convoy or attempting to position itself for a dawn attack on American shipping near Saipan. Major Patterson immediately vectored toward the contact while Chen tracked the submarine's course, noting that it was making 20 knots on a steady heading, unaware of the PBJ-1D approaching from its stern quarter. Japanese submarines had proven vulnerable to air attack when caught on the surface, their crash dive time of 45 seconds insufficient to escape if the attacking aircraft achieved surprise, their deck guns unable to elevate enough to engage aircraft at close range, their crews trained to watch for aircraft during daylight but unprepared for night attack. The rocket attack on the submarine demonstrated the precision possible with radar guidance, Chen calling out range and bearing while Patterson aligned his attack run, releasing 4 rockets at 1,000 yards range, all 4 striking within a 20-foot spread along the submarine's hull. The Japanese submarine I-365, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Takashi Nakagawa, had no warning before the rocket struck, the first indication of attack being the explosions that breached the pressure hull, the submarine's lookouts seeing only the rocket exhaust trails appearing from nowhere, the officer of the deck ordering crash dive even as water flooded through the holes torn by the HVR warheads. Japanese naval doctrine had emphasized optical equipment over electronics, investing in superior binoculars and rangefinders rather than radar development, training lookouts to superhuman levels of visual acuity rather than radar operators to interpret electronic returns, believing that the human eye remained superior to any electronic sensor. This philosophy had served well in the early war when most combat occurred in daylight, when Japanese lookouts consistently spotted enemies before being spotted themselves, when night combat meant close-range surface actions where visual superiority mattered, but it left them completely unprepared for an enemy who had replaced eyes with radar, who could attack accurately without ever seeing the target, who had made darkness irrelevant to combat effectiveness. The I-365 managed to submerge despite the rocket damage, Lieutenant Commander Nakagawa ordering emergency procedures while damage control parties tried to stop the flooding. But the submarine had lost trim control, porpoising dangerously as water shifted in breached compartments, forcing him to surface again after only 3 minutes submerged. When the submarine broke surface, Major Patterson was waiting, having circled back for a second attack run, Chen tracking the submarine through its brief dive, calling out its position when it resurfaced, guiding Patterson for the killing blow with 4 more rockets that struck the submarine's conning tower and engine room, breaking its back, sending it to the bottom with all hands. Marine Squadron VMB 612 would eventually claim 7 ships sunk and over 80 damaged during their deployment, though Japanese records were so confused by the night attacks that accurate correlation proved impossible. Many ships reported as attacked by submarines actually being victims of radar-guided rocket attacks, others attributed to mines or conventional bombing when rockets were responsible. The psychological impact exceeded the physical damage, Japanese merchant sailors becoming reluctant to sail at night, convoy commanders demanding destroyer escorts that the Navy couldn't spare, routes being altered to avoid areas where PBJ-1DS operated even though this added days to voyage times and consumed precious fuel. At 0400 hours, the 5 PBJ-1DS reached the second convoy, spreading out to attack from multiple directions simultaneously, overwhelming the Japanese defensive fire direction that assumed attacks would come from a single bearing, that assumed attackers would be visible in searchlight beams or against the sky. The convoy commander, Captain Hiroshi Yamamoto, had fought through the Solomon Islands campaign, had survived dozens of air attacks, had developed tactics for defeating American dive bombers and torpedo planes, but the rockets coming out of darkness without warning, from multiple directions with no visible aircraft to target, made all his experience worthless. The N/APS-3 radar could distinguish between different ship types by their radar signature, larger ships providing stronger returns, warships with their angular construction giving different patterns than curved hull merchants, allowing radar operators to prioritize targets based on military value rather than size alone. Staff Sergeant Park identified what appeared to be a small tanker in the convoy center, calling this out to Captain Hayes as a priority target. Knowing that fuel shipments were critical to Japanese operations, that destroying one tanker could impact operations more than sinking 3 cargo ships. Captain Hayes aligned his attack on the tanker while his radar operator continued refining the targeting solution, accounting for wind drift, target motion, and the ballistic characteristics of the HVR rockets, all factors that had to be calculated mentally because no mechanical fire control computer existed for rocket attacks. At 800 yards, Hayes triggered all 8 rockets in a rapid salvo, the weapons leaving their rails with a sound like tearing canvas, their exhaust trails drawing parallel lines through the darkness toward the invisible tanker. Staff Sergeant Park counting down the seconds to impact while watching his radar scope for signs of evasive maneuvering. The Japanese tanker Kaioi Maru No. 3 took 6 rocket hits in a pattern that suggested deliberate aim rather than random chance, the HVR warheads penetrating the deck plating and detonating in the fuel bunkers, creating a conflagration that illuminated the entire convoy, revealing the attacking PBJ-1DS for the first time as dark shapes against the flames. The Japanese gun crews immediately opened fire on the now visible aircraft, but the Marines were already climbing away into the darkness. Their attack runs complete, leaving the convoy to deal with a burning tanker that threatened to explode and destroy any ship nearby. Lieutenant David Miller attacked a destroyer escort that was racing to assist the burning tanker, Sergeant Thompson tracking the warship through its radical evasive maneuvers, calling out predictions of where it would be rather than where it was, allowing Miller to lead the target properly with his rockets. The destroyer escort's captain, Lieutenant Commander Kenji Saito, saw the rocket trails approaching and ordered full rudder, but the weapons had been aimed at where his ship would be rather than where it was, for rockets striking along the waterline, flooding the engine room, reducing speed to 5 knots, leaving the warship vulnerable to follow-up attacks. The 5th PBJ-1D, flown by Lieutenant Brown, expended his remaining rockets on a large cargo ship that radar indicated was probably carrying vehicles based on its deck loading pattern, the metal vehicles providing strong radar returns that stood out against the ship's hull. 4 rockets struck the cargo vessel amidships, detonating among trucks loaded with ammunition for the Iwo Jima garrison, creating secondary explosions that ripped the ship apart in seconds, throwing debris hundreds of feet into the air, creating a pillar of fire visible from 50 miles away. Japanese convoy commander Captain Hiroshi Yamamoto would later testify at a naval inquiry that his convoy had been attacked by at least 20 aircraft using some form of invisible bombing that allowed them to strike without being seen, that no existing defensive measures were effective against such attacks, that continuing night convoy operations invited disaster. The Naval General Staff suppressed his testimony, declaring it defeatist, ordering him to retract statements about American technological superiority, insisting that proper vigilance and aggressive maneuvering could defeat any night attack, refusing to acknowledge that the Americans had achieved a capability Japan couldn't match. By 0430, the PBJ-1DS were heading back to Saipan, flying at 8,000 feet to conserve fuel, their radar operators maintaining watch for Japanese night fighters that intelligence suggested were operating from Iwo Jima, though no Marine crew had yet encountered one. The Japanese had attempted to develop night fighter capabilities, installing primitive radar in some aircraft, training pilots in instrument flying, but their efforts remained far behind American developments, their pilots still relying primarily on visual detection, their radar sets unable to track targets effectively, their night fighter doctrine still experimental when the war ended. The return flight required precise navigation, the PBJ-1DS using Loran radio navigation when available, dead reckoning when not, their navigators calculating wind drift and magnetic variation while pilots held steady courses despite the temptation to wander, knowing that fuel margins were too thin for navigation errors. VMB 612 had lost 2 aircraft to fuel exhaustion in their first month of operations, both crews successfully ditching near American submarines stationed as rescue vessels. But Lieutenant Colonel Cram had instituted strict fuel management procedures that prevented further losses, requiring pilots to maintain detailed fuel consumption logs, to calculate optimal cruise settings for every flight phase, to treat fuel as more precious than ammunition. Major Patterson's aircraft landed at Saipan at 0645, just as dawn was breaking over the Pacific, his fuel gauges showing less than 50 gallons remaining, enough for perhaps 15 more minutes of flight, the margin that separated successful missions from disasters in the long-range interdiction role. The ground crews immediately swarmed over the aircraft, checking for battle damage, servicing the engines, preparing for the next mission while intelligence officers debriefed the crews, trying to piece together the full picture of the night's actions from radar returns and visual observations of explosions. The other 4 PBJ-1DS landed over the next 20 minutes, all with minimum fuel, all with expended rocket racks, all with crews exhausted from 10 hours of flight over water and darkness, the strain of radar navigation and attack adding mental fatigue to physical tiredness. The radar operators particularly suffered from eye strain, spending hours staring at the green phosphorescent scope, interpreting returns that could be ships or waves or electronic ghosts, making split-second decisions that determine mission success or failure, all while confined in the cramped nose section of the aircraft with no visual reference to the world outside. Lieutenant Colonel Cram personally debriefed each crew, compiling the intelligence that would be forwarded to Pacific Fleet Headquarters, where Admiral Chester Nimitz and his staff were beginning to appreciate the strategic impact of VMB 612's operations, the disruption to Japanese logistics that exceeded anything conventional bombing had achieved. The ability to interdict shipping at night in weather at extreme range with minimal losses offered possibilities that naval strategists were just beginning to explore, suggesting that radar-guided weapons might revolutionize naval warfare as much as aircraft carriers had. The Japanese Naval General Staff convened an emergency meeting on October 15 to discuss the increasing losses to night attack, Admiral Somu Toyota finally acknowledging that the Americans possessed some form of advanced radar that Japanese technology couldn't detect or counter, ordering research into countermeasures that might never be developed before the war ended. The admission came too late to affect operations, Japanese convoys continuing to suffer losses to invisible attackers, radar-guided rockets appearing from darkness without warning, ships burning and sinking while their crews never saw the aircraft responsible. Captain Minoru Genda, reviewing all available intelligence on American night attack capabilities, concluded that Japan had lost the technology race, that American radar developments had progressed beyond anything Japanese science could match in the remaining months or years of war, that the only defense against radar-guided attack was to avoid sailing at night, which would make resupply of isolated garrisons impossible. His report was classified most secret and restricted to the highest command levels, the implications too devastating for wider distribution, the acknowledgement of technological inferiority too damaging to morale. The 5-inch HVR rocket had proven more effective than even its designers anticipated, the combination of explosive power and kinetic energy capable of destroying light vessels with single hits, damaging capital ships enough to require extensive repairs, creating psychological effects that exceeded physical damage as Japanese sailors developed an almost superstitious fear of the invisible rockets. Marine ground crews painted kill markings on the PBJ-1DS, ship silhouettes for confirmed sinkings, damaged symbols for probable hits, creating a visual record of VMB 612's effectiveness that visiting officers found difficult to believe until they saw the intelligence photographs of burned and sunken Japanese vessels. On October 16, VMB 612 launched another maximum effort mission, 12 PBJ-1DS taking off at 1-hour intervals to maintain continuous coverage of the sea lanes between Iwo Jima and Chichijima, their radar operators searching for the nightly convoys that intelligence indicated were attempting to reinforce both garrisons before the expected American invasions. The Japanese had tried various countermeasures, sailing without lights, maintaining radio silence, following irregular routes, but the N/APS-3 radar could detect ships regardless of these measures, tracking them by their metal hulls rather than any emissions, finding them in the vast Pacific by systematic searching that covered thousands of square miles each night. Technical Sergeant Chen, flying his 23rd mission, had developed an intuitive understanding of radar returns that went beyond technical training, recognizing ship types by subtle differences in their electronic signatures, predicting evasive maneuvers by watching return patterns, even estimating cargo loads by how ships sat in the water based on their radar profiles. He had destroyed more tonnage than many submarine commanders, all without ever seeing most of his targets except as green phosphorescent blips on a radar screen, conducting warfare through electronics rather than eyesight, representing a new breed of warrior that military academies hadn't yet learned to train. The Japanese merchant marine had lost over 60% of its tonnage by October 1944, much of it to submarines, but an increasing percentage to air attack, particularly night air attack that convoy planners couldn't effectively counter, forcing ships to sail independently rather than in convoys that attracted attackers, increasing voyage times and fuel consumption while decreasing efficiency. The logistics network that had sustained Japanese expansion was collapsing, isolated garrisons running short of everything from rice to ammunition, reinforcements unable to reach combat zones, the carefully planned defense of the inner perimeter falling apart because ships couldn't sail safely even in darkness. Marine Squadron VMB 612 had proven that technology could overcome traditional advantages of darkness and distance, that radar-guided weapons could achieve accuracy comparable to visual bombing, that night no longer provided sanctuary from air attack. The psychological impact on Japanese forces exceeded the physical destruction. The knowledge that darkness no longer meant safety, that American technology had advanced beyond anything Japan could counter, that the war had become a contest of science as much as courage, all contributing to the growing sense that defeat was inevitable. Lieutenant Commander Takashi Nakagawa's submarine I-365 had been the 7th confirmed submarine kill by radar-equipped aircraft, the combination of radar detection and rocket attack proving lethal to submarines caught on the surface, forcing Japanese submarine doctrine to change, boats remaining submerged during daylight and surfacing only briefly at night to charge batteries, reducing their operational effectiveness while trying to avoid the invisible hunters. The submarine force that had once ranged freely across the Pacific was being reduced to coastal defense, unable to operate effectively in waters patrolled by radar-equipped aircraft. Another example of how technology was determining victory. By November 1944, VMB 612 had refined their tactics further, discovering that flying at exactly 285 feet altitude optimized radar returns from surface vessels while minimizing sea clutter, that approaching targets from down-moon prevented any possibility of visual detection, that rockets fired in pairs at 2-second intervals produced better hit percentages than full salvos. These seemingly minor refinements, documented in after-action reports and shared among crews, represented the accumulation of combat experience that no amount of peacetime training could replicate, the practical knowledge that transformed good units into exceptional ones. The N/APS-3 radar sets required constant maintenance in the Pacific environment, humidity and salt air corroding connections, vibration loosening components, temperature variations affecting calibration, all requiring ground crews to develop expertise beyond their formal training. Chief Petty Officer Harold Morrison, VMB 612 senior radar technician, had written his own maintenance manual based on experience, documenting problems the manufacturer hadn't anticipated, solutions that weren't in any technical publication, creating institutional knowledge that would influence radar maintenance procedures throughout the Marine Corps. Japanese Captain Hiroshi Yamamoto, reassigned to staff duty after losing 3 ships from his convoy, spent his remaining war years trying to develop counters to American radar technology, proposing everything from radar-absorbing coatings to electronic jamming, but Japan's electronics industry couldn't produce the components needed for effective countermeasures, couldn't match American production capacity even if designs were perfected, couldn't overcome the years of advantage that American and British research had achieved. His reports emphasized that Japan was fighting a war with 1930s technology against an enemy wielding 1950s capabilities, an imbalance that no amount of spiritual determination could overcome. The 5-inch HVR rocket production had reached 100,000 units per month by late 1944, more rockets than there were suitable targets, allowing Marine squadrons to expend them freely without concern for shortages, a luxury Japanese forces hadn't enjoyed since early 1942. The rockets were simple enough to maintain and reliable enough to trust, unlike the complex torpedoes that plagued both American and Japanese forces, giving pilots confidence that their weapons would function when fired, that technical failure wouldn't waste carefully planned attack runs. On November 3, 1944, VMB 612 achieved their most successful mission, 3 PBJ-1DS locating and attacking a major convoy attempting to evacuate important personnel from Iwo Jima before the expected invasion, the radar operators detecting 12 vessels in close formation, probably assuming that concentration would provide better anti-aircraft defense. The Marines attacked in sequence, each aircraft making multiple runs until all rockets were expended, the convoy's defensive fire wild and ineffective against aircraft they couldn't see, ships burning and exploding while gunners fired blindly into the darkness, tracers arcing uselessly through empty sky while rockets continued to strike from unexpected angles. The convoy commander, Rear Admiral Takeo Kurita, survived the attack but lost his flagship and 6 other vessels, his after-action report stating that the enemy has achieved technical superiority that makes traditional naval warfare obsolete, a conclusion that the Naval General Staff rejected as defeatist but couldn't refute with evidence. The radar-guided rocket attacks continued through November and December, Japanese losses mounting while defensive measures proved ineffective, darkness no longer providing protection, distance no longer preventing attack, the ocean itself becoming hostile territory where American technology reached out to destroy ships that thought themselves beyond range. Lieutenant Colonel Jack Cram received the Navy Cross for developing the tactics that made VMB 612 so effective, though he always insisted the credit belonged to his Marines who flew into darkness trusting their radar operators, who maintained aircraft in primitive conditions, who pushed human endurance to its limits on 10-hour missions, who transformed theoretical possibilities into combat realities. The squadron's success influenced Marine Corps doctrine for decades, establishing the principle that technology properly employed could overcome traditional military disadvantages, that innovation mattered as much as courage, that adapting to new capabilities faster than the enemy could mean victory with minimal casualties. The PBJ-1D Mitchell bomber had never been intended for the role VMB 612 employed it in, but war's necessity had transformed it into something its designers never imagined, a night stalker that could see in darkness, strike without warning, disappear before retaliation, representing the fusion of American industrial capability and Marine Corps adaptability that characterized the Pacific War's later stages. The aircraft that had begun as a conventional medium bomber had become a technological terror weapon, not through massive firepower or revolutionary design, but through the addition of a radar set that weighed less than 200 pounds but changed everything about how war could be fought. By December 1944, Japanese merchant captains were refusing to sail certain routes, claiming mechanical problems rather than admit fear, knowing that darkness no longer protected them, that American radar could find them anywhere in the vast Pacific, that rockets would come without warning to send their ships to the bottom. The impact on Japanese logistics was catastrophic, isolated garrisons surrendering not from combat defeats but from starvation, ammunition supplies dwindling because ships couldn't get through, the entire defensive strategy collapsing because America had learned to see in the dark. Technical Sergeant Chen completed his 50th mission on December 15, 1944, having personally directed attacks that sank or damaged 23 vessels, never seeing most of them except as radar returns, conducting warfare through technology rather than direct observation, representing a new form of combat that military theorists were just beginning to understand. His expertise with the IN/APS-3 radar had reached an almost mystical level, able to identify ship types by subtle variations in return patterns, predict evasive maneuvers before they began, guide pilots to perfect attack positions despite darkness and weather, demonstrating that human skill amplified by technology could achieve things neither could accomplish alone. The Japanese Naval Technical Department finally acquired a captured IN/APS-3 set from a crashed PBJ-1D in January 1945, their scientists amazed by the cavity magnetron technology, the frequency ranges achieved, the power output from such a compact unit, realizing that American radar technology was at least 5 years ahead of Japanese developments. The technical analysis concluded that Japan had no possibility of matching American radar capabilities before the war ended. No chance of developing effective countermeasures with available resources. No option except to endure continued losses to an enemy that had made darkness transparent. Marine Squadron VMB 612 moved to Iwo Jima in April 1945, extending their reach to the Japanese home islands. Their PBJ-1DS now able to strike shipping in the inland sea, mining harbors by radar navigation, attacking warships attempting to hide in coastal waters, demonstrating that nowhere in the shrinking Japanese empire was safe from radar-guided attack. The psychological impact on Japanese morale was devastating, the knowledge that American technology could reach anywhere, strike without warning, see through any concealment, contributing to the growing recognition that the war was lost. The 5-inch HVR rocket had evolved through combat experience, ground crews learning to adjust fusing for different target types, pilots discovering optimal release parameters for various conditions, the weapon becoming more effective through use rather than design changes, demonstrating that combat experience could improve weapons as much as laboratory development. By war's end, Marine pilots could achieve hit rates exceeding 60% with radar-guided rockets, accuracy that exceeded visual bombing in many conditions, proving that technology had fundamentally changed the nature of air-to-surface warfare. Captain Minoru Genda, reflecting on the war after Japan's surrender, wrote that we were defeated not by American courage, which we could match, nor by American production, which we understood, but by American technology, which we never imagined, particularly their ability to see in darkness, to strike without warning, to make our night sanctuaries into killing grounds. His analysis influenced Japanese post-war development, the nation determining never again to fall behind in technology, to invest in electronics and radar, to understand that modern warfare required science as much as spirit. The final mission of VMB 612 occurred on August 14, 1945, the day before Japan's surrender, 3 PBJ-1DS attacking a convoy attempting to evacuate military personnel from Korea, their radar operators detecting and tracking targets one last time, their pilots firing rockets that had become routine, their crews completing another 10-hour mission that had once seemed impossible but had become standard. The Marines landed at Okinawa as the war ended, their aircraft bearing the scars of hundreds of combat hours, their scoreboards showing ships destroyed that Japanese records couldn't even properly account for, their achievement in night warfare influencing military doctrine for generations. Lieutenant Colonel Cram's after-action report emphasized that VMB 612 had proven concepts that would define future warfare. That technology could overcome traditional military advantages, that radar-guided weapons could achieve precision without visual contact, that night operations could be as effective as daylight attacks, that small units with advanced capabilities could achieve strategic effects beyond their numbers. His Marines had transformed night warfare in the Pacific, making darkness irrelevant to American air power, demonstrating that technological superiority could determine victory as surely as numerical advantage, forever changing how naval warfare would be conducted. The N/APS-3 radar system that had seemed almost magical to Japanese observers was actually just the beginning of American electronic warfare capabilities, primitive by later standards but revolutionary for its time, proving that investment in research and development could produce advantages that no amount of traditional military preparation could counter. The radar sets that had guided Marines to their targets through darkness represented American industrial and scientific capability focused on military application, the translation of theoretical physics into practical weapons, the fusion of science and warfare that would characterize all future conflicts.